When you hollow out the deep state, the security state, as President Trump has done, you get confirmation bias. You don't have people challenging you.
What you're saying is fundamentally the leadership structure in Washington, in the court of King Donald I, is such that he's not getting pushback from the experts who might say, hang on, Mr. President, let's think about this.
Well, if he is, he's not listening to them. Kharg Island doesn't allow you to open the Strait of Hormuz. It brings economic pressure.
It gives you leverage. It gives you leverage.
Exactly.
It's all about leverage.
It's an extraordinary, difficult task to undertake. And having then seized an island like this, you then become a static target.
Kharg Island could become a trap, couldn't it? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Is President Trump on the cusp of abandoning his war with Iran or about to double down with boots on the ground? He's lashed out again at his NATO allies, threatening to abandon the alliance, raising questions not only about the future of the war, but the future of Western security itself. Well, joining me today is General Sir Patrick Sanders, who's had a 40-year career in the British Army and rose to Chief of the General Staff in 2022. He retired 2 years later. He spent his career thinking about the hard realities of modern conflict, the limits of Western military power, and what happens if and when the United States wavers. So Patrick, welcome to the Forecast.
Thank you, Matt.
Looking at the number of troops that Donald Trump is sending and has sent to the Gulf, is that enough to actually take Kharg Island or to fight your way through the strait, which they may have to do? Or is it performative? Is it part of the negotiating tactic? As a military planner, what do you think?
Well, it's reactive. Because
what does that mean?
Well, if you thought that these objectives were going to be necessary at the outset of this conflict, you would have them in theatre already at hand, and they don't. And it's been incremental. First of all, they deployed a Marine Expeditionary Unit, redeployed from Japan. They're now bringing one across from California, and they've got elements of the 82nd Airborne being flown in as well. So they're having to react to what's going on the battlefield, which suggests that in many respects they've lost some of the initiative. Now, it's possible that these were part of the original build-up of forces. I mean, to get to your question, the answer, as in all things, is it depends. It depends what objectives you're trying to seize, how long you're trying to hold on for them. What they offer most value for at the moment is as a negotiating tactic, as a lever, because they're a threat that the Iranians have to take into account.
Okay, that's interesting. So if he decided that he wanted to not just use them as a lever, but actually get his men and women to try and occupy this one island, and there are lots of other islands on the way to Kharg Island, as you know, could they do it with that force, considering what they're facing on the other side?
Yes, because the United States military are, as we're seeing playing out in front of us, exceptionally at what they do in terms of achieving tactical success and indeed operational success on the battlefield. What we're not seeing is that tactical excellence leading to political outcomes. And I don't want to try and predict which of these objectives they might take. It could be that they seize Kharg Island as a long-term negotiating tactic to put economic pressure on the Iranian regime. But it's also possible that there might be some more limited objectives or raids where they don't stay, they don't linger. It's a raid in and out to achieve a limited set of objectives, and they move on.
But if they move in and out and they leave, the Iranians are still there. I mean, they're resilient and they've hunkered down. And, they've shown, a surprising ability to still throw stuff at people. It doesn't really end the crisis, does it, around the Strait of Hormuz?
No, the confidence, so the international community's confidence in being able to put shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is only going to change when the Iranian regime either falls or it changes its behavior. Right. Because it can produce enough of a threat to be a nuisance, to be a risk to shipping in spite of all of the degradation and destruction that Israel and the US have imposed on them. So that's why I think this is more of a negotiating strategy than it is a practical option at the moment.
Interesting. So as a military planner, given what you're seeing, in the American Navy, the massing of troops and so on, if you were in charge of this operation, you would say, I would not I would not want to launch a full-scale invasion of these little islands or even one little island with what I've got available. This is just there as a ploy, as a bargaining tactic. Would you go ahead with a military operation given the number of troops that you've got there?
So again, the answer is it depends. I mean, we have been very quick to write off the achievements, the military achievements that the IDF and the United States military are securing at the moment. Because although it looks less and less likely that these will lead to regime change, what is very clear is that the destruction of Iran's ability to export violence, to threaten its neighbors, is being fundamentally undermined. And this is a campaign that still has some weeks to run, right. And it's probably a little bit too premature to judge whether or not it's going to be a complete failure. As far as the land forces are concerned, in that context, it's conceivable that you could secure these objectives as part of, once you have further destroyed lots of these capabilities. It's simply too early to tell.
In case you need them or if you want them.
So the job of military...
In a couple of weeks' time, when they've depleted their ballistic capabilities even more, on all the other stuff that they're firing at people, you might want to go in.
You might, and I haven't seen. I mean, I saw earlier iterations of the plan because we've been planning this for on and off for 2 decades for what would happen if. In this case, I don't know where we are against the target list, the military objectives that are trying to be perceived. I don't know whether they're turning from red to amber to green. I suspect more and more of them are going green.
Well, let me put it this way then, because you said earlier that it was the number of troops and the way they've been deployed, it looks to you as if it's reactive rather than pre-planned. And I just wonder, and as you said, for decades now, you've been planning similar scenarios, and I'm sure they've been doing the same in the Pentagon. There must be entire cupboards full of what to do if the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded. So do you think that they weren't listening to these plans, or that they never got them out of the drawer, or that Trump thought he can do it without the plans because, hey, I just managed to decapitate the leadership of Venezuela in 24 hours and everything's fine? What's going on there?
I think it's the latter. Yes, and a sequel to Venezuela, and an overconfidence in what military force can achieve, and underestimating the Iranian resolve, the resilience of the regime, the effect that drones can have, despite being able to take out the missile launchers. So it has definitely gone on for longer, I think, and has been much harder than anyone was anticipating. But there are, as you say, there's a whole family of plans. It's everybody anticipated the Straits of Hormuz. I just don't think that those plans were necessarily introduced. And when you hollow out the deep state as the security state, as President Trump has done, the National Security Council, all of that has been fundamentally sort of hollowed out, and you appoint people like Tulsi Gabbard as your director of national intelligence, you get confirmation bias. You don't have people challenging, you don't have people pointing to the risks.
Actually, interestingly enough, she's one of the few people who has challenged him on the floor of Congress. So she's actually one of the few people who stood up and said, no, that was not the case. They were not an imminent threat and so on. But I guess, so what you're saying is fundamentally the leadership structure in Washington, in the court of King Donald I, is such that he's not getting pushback from the experts who might say, hang on, Mr. President, let's think about this.
Well, if he is, he's not listening to them. And the other thing that you would do, in any event with a strike on Iran, the Strait of Hormuz was always going to come into play. So the smart thing to do would have been to build up resilience in the region so that it gave the military more time to achieve its task. And that means ensuring that your allies are part of it, that energy stockpiles have been built up around the world, that we weren't quite as dependent on the Strait as we have become. These would all have been smart things to do in advance. But this feels like something that was quite abrupt.
And just one more on this. I mean, Kharg Island, and everyone seems to be obsessed with a place that they couldn't locate on a map until a few weeks ago, and that includes me. Kharg Island could become a trap, couldn't it?
Well, any amphibious operation brings with it enormous risks. There are the number of amphibious operations in history that have been successful are much smaller than those that have failed.
Right.
It's an extraordinarily difficult task to undertake. And having then seized an island like this, you then become a static target. This is not an undertaking to be done lightly. But if I was to choose a set of armed forces to do it, who would be the best in the world at doing it? It would be the United States Marine Corps and the 82nd Airborne.
But even if you seize it and you open up the Strait of Hormuz for a bit, who's to say that the Iranians won't fire a drone from 500 kilometers away, or whatever the range is, that will hit a single tanker on a Wednesday, and suddenly everyone is running scared and the insurance premiums go sky high again?
Yes, but Kharg Island doesn't allow you to open the Strait of Hormuz. It brings economic pressure.
It gives you leverage.
Exactly.
It's all about leverage.
Yes.
But so at the end of the day, you're still pursuing a deal with the Iranian regime.
Exactly. It's about changing the regime's behavior and calculus and contributing to negotiations in a deal.
Okay.
But it will take time for that to achieve. If you want to directly secure territory that allows you to control the Strait of Hormuz, then that's going to be much closer to the strait itself. And you're absolutely right. Absent Iranian compliance with some sort of a deal, you're always going to be at risk from a drone that can be launched from hundreds or thousands of kilometers away.
If Trump declares victory in a television address, there's one tonight, and walks away in a couple of weeks' time, the strait is still effectively blockaded, or a Tehran toll booth, what would you say to that victory?
Well, it depends on how you frame it and what you're measuring. So if the objective was to remove Iran's nuclear capabilities, no. Mm-hmm. If it was to reduce its ability to threaten others with conventional forces and missiles, yes. Mm-hmm. If it was to ensure that there's free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, no. And if it was to remove the regime, no. So that looks, on those terms, it looks like a defeat. But what Trump could point to is a more limited set of objections and say, look, we were just trying to weaken them. That was all just negotiating stuff that I said. And by the way, the real business is going to be in the Indo-Pacific. We know that the threat to our partners in the region increases from 2027 onwards. So it was important to deal with Venezuela, Iran, so that we could sequence that before bringing force to bear or pressure to bear against China. Oh, and by the way, that's why we need to keep Russia sweet, because we can't deal with those two. But I doubt that sort of long-term strategic thinking is necessarily going on in the president's mind.
I don't think so. It doesn't look like it. And also, by not really telling us why he went to war, it's fuzzy enough for him to come up with different explanations, although not very convincing. Quite a lot of news around about NATO. So again, Trump has insulted his NATO allies. He's also again threatened to pull out of the alliance. And more importantly, perhaps, his rather calmer Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said something similar. How dangerous is this for NATO?
Well, it's not good, because although, in process terms, the president can't unilaterally withdraw from an alliance, that requires Congress to endorse that. Of course, what it does do is it undermines what the alliance is really underpinned by, which is this sense of confidence that it's all for one and one for all. That the United States and any ally, as we did after 9/11, would step up if an Article 5 declaration was invoked. But it's not good for the United States either, because if you're sitting in the US, you rely on NATO for access, for basing, for overflight, and that's been undermined a little bit by recent events. We can come back to talking about that. But NATO amplifies your power, your authority. You have the world's most powerful, the world's most successful alliance, and that has, to a very large extent, supported the America in becoming as dominant as it is. And from what the United States would lose, they would not only lose, if you like, security over the back door to the United States. I mean, the North Atlantic, the Kola Peninsula, all these threats are secured for the US by NATO allies. So it's not good for NATO, but nor is it good for the US.
How do you think President Trump regards NATO? What does he see it as compared to previous presidents?
I think he regards NATO as a group of relatives who come round and use your pool. He's pay enough to use it. Yeah, exactly. And pay very little or no rent. And that because he's fundamentally, he's not an internationalist, he's not a multilateralist. He doesn't really see the strength that alliances bring. He only sees things in transactional terms. And so he's always instinctively reached for criticizing NATO. It's not the first time. We saw it in his first administration as well. But NATO has also given him a real success story because, of course, he's been able to point to the fact that because of his pressure, he's been the first president, and we should give him credit for this. He's been the first president who has actually forced NATO to move from a very small number of countries who spent 2% to now almost all of them, and a declaration that will move to 5%.
With a little help from Vladimir Putin.
Yes, a little help from the world, from the world becoming a much more dangerous place. That's true. But the 2% pressure came in his first administration.
But I mean, getting back to his vision of NATO, I mean, the only time that Article 5 of NATO was ever invoked was in support of the United States after 9/11. He is very upset that NATO partners aren't rushing to the Strait of Hormuz to help him out with something that he may not have foreseen. Is he right to be upset with us?
No, because first of all, as you say, after 9/11, Article 5 was invoked, and then a very large number of NATO countries committed to operating alongside the US as part of the global war on terror. And many of those countries took very significant levels of casualties, not least our own, and in some cases, a much higher proportion of casualties per capita than the United States did. So NATO has backed the US before. In this case here, if you want allies to fight alongside you, then you've got to ensure that you have explained clearly what the objectives, the strategic objectives of the war are. You've allowed them to take decisions about whether or not they're going to put their men and women in harm's way in pursuit of that, and given them feel that they've got a stake in this. What you can't do is expect allies to come along after you haven't done any of those things. The only area where I think we could have done things perhaps a little differently is around access basing and overflight.
Right. Okay. But now we're in a position where the French, the Spaniards, the Italians have said no American planes that are on bombing missions to Iran flying through our airspace. Things have got quite a lot worse just in the last few weeks, haven't they? But I wonder, getting back to the original question, do you think that this fractured relationship has already hollowed out NATO to such an extent that it is no longer an effective alliance, even if the Americans don't just walk out of the exit door?
No, I think it's a little early to start writing NATO's obituary. Because what you see in terms of the US-European relationship is, and it's been described as an iceberg, very, very choppy on the surface, but particularly for the UK, you have this, hidden depth beneath it where everything actually is quite calm. And the mill-to-mill relationships, the security relationships are actually very strong. So
is that still the case? Because I read just the other day an intelligence report saying that they're still strong on paper, but getting a little bit more sticky. So it takes just a little bit longer for the Brits to give permission to American bombers to fly from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. Brits have been asked to leave intelligence meetings chaired by Americans.
Well, it has happened before. And these things, and there have been worse crises in the transatlantic relationship. You can point to Suez, you can point to the invasion of Grenada. There have been moments in the past where we really have had higher levels of tension, and we've fallen out more than this. But there is no doubt, I wouldn't deny it, that that the confidence that the US had in the case of the UK, that we would provide access to RAF Fairford and to Diego Garcia in all circumstances, pretty much in an Iran contingency, that's been shaken, and so that has caused,
that was a mistake from the Prime Minister.
Well, I think so. I think so. Yes, I think that that has been such a fundamental underpinning. We have been involved in very different iterations of planning for contingencies in the Gulf and Iran. In some scenarios, we would have committed naval assets, air assets, but the thing that has been constant through all of that is the assumption that we would provide that access, basing, and overflight. And I think we should have done.
So, kind of not taking too much store by the language used by Trump, some of the words, some of the adjectives, was he essentially right to be as upset with us as he was over the base?
In that narrow question, yes, over the basis, I think he was.
But generally speaking, kind of humiliating your allies and friends and insulting them doesn't work.
Well, it's not the best way of, when sooner or later the United States is going to need allies. It would have been a lot more convenient for him if he could turn to allies now, and in alienating them, you leave yourself weaker and more exposed.
Do you actually think that he will walk out of NATO?
Well, he doesn't get to. What he can do.
But he sends that signal. He won't get the votes in Congress, unlikely to. But
no, I don't. I think this is noise. I think that the signal is reasonably constant. What that doesn't mean, though, is that we shouldn't recognise that the United States are probably going to commit less to NATO over time because they've given us fair warning that they would, and that they're going to reprioritise as their national security strategy sets out towards their own hemisphere and to the Indo-Pacific and for preparing for a confrontation with China. So Europe certainly has to do a lot more to take responsibility for our own security, but I don't think there's going to be a rupture in the alliance.
Where does this leave us in Britain? Our so-called special relationship has been rattled, to say the least. I'm told that we rely more on America for our security than other European nations do. Is that correct?
It leaves us uniquely exposed in Europe.
Uniquely exposed.
Because we have, on the one hand, we have severed our formal relationships with the European Union. And at the same time, we have become over-dependent on the United States. Now, a lot of that relationship, that security and defense relationship that we have with the US, which is very deep and actually plays to both countries, both nations' advantages, it keeps us safe every single day. I mean, just look at counterterrorism and the benefits we draw from that relationship. Look at our access to space and space-based surveillance. There's a phenomenal amount that we get from that relationship, and the US do too. But we are also more dependent. Our nuclear deterrent
comes... Just in very practical terms, describe that dependence. What can't we do without the Americans giving us the green light?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we have a lack of sovereignty. So if you look at the nuclear deterrent, it is genuinely independent.
Right. We can use our nuclear weapons if we want to, whether the Americans like it or not.
Exactly. So it is a truly independent nuclear deterrent in terms of its operation, but its development, the warheads are done in conjunction with the United States.
Right. Okay. So we need, the kit is basically sorted out with the US in the US, and without their help, it can't function.
Well, we would have to go it alone, and that is a very, very challenging proposition and an unbelievably expensive one.
It's not really an option then.
Well, you don't rule anything out.
But is that the bottom line for us? Is it such a costly option that we don't really want to contemplate going that far down the road of rupture?
I mean, I can't see in the current fiscal environment, I can't see any government wanting to do that. But we did do it before. We developed our nuclear weapons ourselves when the United States didn't support us. So there is precedent. We've done it ourselves before. The French have done it separately. They drew different lessons from the Suez crisis. So it is feasible, but it's very expensive.
I mean, you mentioned Suez, and British troops didn't fight in Vietnam, and Grenada was a problem between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But this strikes me as being different because of the language used, and also because we're more exposed to some extent by being alone. We don't have a gang anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a gang because we're part of NATO. So we have an alliance structure that we're part of, and that provides our collective security. And
a gang in some trouble.
A gang that is getting stronger. NATO is stronger. I mean, I don't want to be argumentative, but it is. This is why I say it's too soon to start writing NATO's obituary. NATO is significantly stronger than it was before 2022.
Because of the money spent, in part?
Well, because of the money spent, but also because we've had Sweden and Finland join, and they are net providers of security. They offer more to the alliance than they take. So NATO is stronger, but there's no doubt that with the US, first of all, expressing or saying things that sow doubt about Article 5 commitments, Europe has to take more responsibility. European members of NATO have to take much more responsibility for their own security.
But getting back to the tone of the relationship, does it strike you as someone who's got a long memory, who's been through these crises, does it strike you as being different? Or are we all a bit too hysterical about the kind of language that comes out of the White House?
Well, the president is unique. He operates in international relations and diplomacy in a way that no one has done before, and he breaks China by doing so. But it's it's really important to distinguish between the president and the man and the United States and the country, and they are not the same thing.
Yeah. And he breaks China, but not breaks the China, but not China, as it were. That's another question. Yeah,
let's hope not.
Anyway, can NATO survive as a kind of European rump without the United States in an effective way?
Yes, because it will have to. But it will very much depend on how the United States disengage from NATO goes. We're assuming that there will be a drawdown of US assets committed to NATO, or certainly based forward in Europe. But we're also assuming that drawdown will be graceful in a way that allows us to increase the number of, to fill the gap, to step up the capabilities. Yeah. If it was done overnight, if there was a rupture, there was a divorce, then it would put Europe in a very difficult set of circumstances, and we would have to go much further and faster than we're doing even at the moment.
And if that were to happen, to what extent do you think Vladimir Putin could exploit that? Just, in military terms.
Well, Putin can. So it's important to think about what Putin's aims are, and he's got three aims as it relates to the war at the moment. The first is clearly to reduce Ukraine to a vassal state. The second is to expand the territorial influence that Russia has over what you would describe as Ruski Mir, the Russian-speaking world, what he would call historical Russia. But the third aim, which is the most important and the most pertinent, is to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe and to dismantle the European security architecture. So because Putin is a tactician, he's an opportunist, that the risk that we have to address is that he would move against NATO territory, or he would pose a question about Article 5 that the alliance fails to answer. And at that point, that begins to look like a strategic win for Russia, because once you have proven that Article 5 doesn't count, then alliance cohesion and the alliance itself begins to look meaningless.
And that could be a Russian attack on one of the Baltic states. Cyber attacks are taking place all the time, but it could be something in that corner of Europe.
That is the scenario that is most often pointed to,
and it's a likely one. Do you think?
I think it's a reasonable possibility, and I think that the time frame is the key. We have to keep in mind, and there are plenty of intelligence assessments that point to this, that Russia retains the capability to embark on a second operation at the moment. That in order to pose a limited challenge, taking a limited amount of territory, it wouldn't need that much combat power if it was able to surprise us, because he could then just sit back behind its nuclear umbrella and say, come on, what are you going to do about it? And the time frame that we're talking about here is a 3 to 5 year time frame. Right. So I was talking to the Minister of the Armed Forces on my podcast, The General and the Journalist, just a few weeks ago, and he said 3 years.
Okay, let's move to a subject that is very close to your heart, which is the state of our defense here in this country on this island. If there was to be a nasty shooting war, whether it involves the Iranians or the Russians that kind of got close to our shores, how well equipped are we to fight?
Well, we've got armed forces that are, and I say this not as a sort of because I'm advertising, but are among the most professional in the world, and certainly among the most professional in Europe and NATO. But they are configured for an era of crises, not of conflict at this scale. So we are operationally excellent in all kinds of areas, different domains, different technologies, but we are no longer at the scale or the capacity or have the readiness to deal with the sort of conflict that you're describing.
And how do we get to that place? In 20 seconds.
Well, we could start by implementing what the Strategic Defence Review pointed to, because the government very sensibly had a review.
Yeah.
It pointed to the risks that we were facing and the need to change. And since then, we've had nothing but a deafening silence. And the Defence Investment Plan, which is supposed to deliver means behind that, is still nowhere apparently near publishing. And our forces are atrophying as we speak, and defence industry is starting to give up in despair. So the first thing to do would be give meaning to the review that you carried out, because it's certainly clear to the British public that we're living in a more dangerous world. Why isn't it clear to the government, and why aren't they acting?
Let's say we did get into a nasty shooting war with Russia, maybe Iran on their side, who knows? I mean, how many days or weeks would we have before we got into real trouble?
So I'm not going to get into the limits of our stockpiles, because I don't think that would be helpful. And I should point to the fact that we would not be fighting alone. We would be fighting as part of NATO. But it should be very clear to people that deterrence comes from not only being able to be there and fight on the first day, but being able to demonstrate that you can sustain that effort, because wars historically tend to be long, not short. You can sustain that effort. And that means having a strong industrial base. It means having deep stockpiles of ammunition. And the truth at the moment is that we will be able to fight for a matter of weeks and no more.
Weeks. I mean, the other question, I guess, is that if you tell the public that there's a real problem here, we're done after a couple of weeks, we can't carry on, there has to be a much bigger commitment. We've got to think about things like national service, et cetera, whatever that is. The question that will come back from the public is, what exactly is that imminent threat for us here on the island? I don't think people can imagine, Russian troops landing on the white cliffs of Dover, or maybe, Iranian missiles actually flying into London, or whatever combination of menace we might get. And so tell us about the actual threat beyond the kind of collapse of NATO and and confidence and all that, the actual threat to people living on this island.
Well, we experience it every single day. So Russia sees itself, Putin's Russia sees itself as being at war with the West now. And we see this coming through, what we might describe as hybrid or sub-threshold threats. But, as an example, what matters most to the British people, probably the National Health Service would be at the top of the list. Every single NHS trust has been attacked by Russian cyber actors. Every single one. Where does our source of strength come from? It's from our financial services sector in the city. It's probably the greatest asset we have in the UK. That is under constant threat. So we're already at risk being attacked by Russia, and these are probing attacks to weaken our society, to attack our infrastructure. Look at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Russia isn't necessarily trying to achieve its strategic outcomes on the battlefield, and if it is, it's failing at it. But what it is doing is consistently and persistently attacking critical national infrastructure in Ukraine.
But it's doing that mostly with drones and missiles flying into power stations. And
to which we have almost
But that's not going to happen here, or
well,
is it?
Why wouldn't it?
Okay, so that is a possibility here.
Of course. Of course it is.
They have the range. They could do it.
They absolutely have the range, and we don't have the air defense systems and we're not going to have them for a long time, to be able to defend the whole of the UK.
What do we have in terms of, our equivalent of an Iron Dome or David's arrow and sling, what the Israelis have? Much vaunted. What do we have?
Well, we have the Type 45 destroyers. That is, and we also sit, this is the benefit of being part of NATO, but if you have the collapse of NATO, the capabilities that NATO allies bring, which do protect us, are no longer available to us. So even if the threat isn't directly to the UK territorially, it will be in our waters, it will be to our infrastructure. And if a Baltic state, or one that we're responsible for defending, Estonia, does fall and does collapse, that directly undermines our safety and our security too. The trick is not to have to fight. Build up your defences so that you don't have to, so you can deter by denial. And the costs of this, we forget, because we've been so lucky to grow up in peace, we forget that, in 1937, we're spending about the same amount on GDP of defence as we are at the moment. By 1940, it's 10%.
Yeah.
By 1945, it's 50%.
But in order for governments to make that case and persuade people that they have to tighten their belts to spend more money on defence, or maybe even send their kids to some kind of national service, the government needs to make a very clear argument. And part of that argument is a very clear understanding of where the threat lies. And I've not heard that yet from the government.
No, so that I agree with.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because
so we've heard
people have to believe that there is a credible threat there.
We've heard it occasionally. So the Prime Minister has made some good speeches. He talked about defence being the central organising principle of government about a year ago. At the Munich Security Conference, he was very strong on needing to step up and pointing to the threat. But if you contrast the position in the UK with the position in, say, the Nordics or the Baltics, if you live in those countries through a combination of historical experience and your geography, you absolutely understand that Russia is a threat. And those countries have created an awareness where there are very, very high levels of support for conscription, for defence spending, where the whole of society understands how to become more resilient, how to respond if there's an attack, how not to panic. And that's because the government is honest with them. It points to the threats. It doesn't treat them like children. It points to what the threats are, and it gives them the tool.
Yeah, but they're right next door. So geography, acts in their favour. I mean, it's both a problem and it's an opportunity. So
point to me an era when the UK was insulated from threats in Europe. I mean, there are none.
There are none.
Our geography makes us as vital. Our security depends on European security. We can't. The Channel is no longer this moat. I mean, self-evidently.
Okay, but this is important, isn't it? Because I'm sure you'll say, let's not frighten the horses. We don't want to create panic. We don't want Sir Patrick Sanders to come up with headlines that will appear on the papers. But actually, a degree of fear is important in this argument, isn't it? To be credible. So let me ask you specifically, if a Russian missile, comes for the UK, what will shoot it down?
A NATO asset, a NATO air defense asset.
If there's a rain of missiles, maybe some Iranian drones, or not that they won't go far enough, but Iranian missiles into the mix, the kind that they were lobbing at Diego Garcia the other day. Is it possible that we will be overwhelmed by the number of missiles coming in, and we won't be able to shoot them down?
So I think because the United States and Israel have worked so effectively at the Iranian ballistic missile systems,
that's not going to happen.
That threat is much reduced.
But not with Russia.
The point is, I mean, when I took over as Chief of the General Staff, I made a historical comparison which got a lot of publicity, and I talked about this being a 1937 moment. The point I was trying to make is it's not 1939, it's not 1940, but look around you. It seems to be very clear to the British public, 40% of whom think that we will be engaged in a war in the next 5 years, that the world has changed. But we're not doing enough to address those, and we're not doing it fast enough. So to go to your point about being alarmist, 37 I thought was an important date to do. Technically I was wrong, because that was what, 4 years ago, and
we'd now be in the middle of World War II.
1941. Exactly. But the reason we aren't is because Ukraine has been buying us time.
Yeah.
But as each year goes by, we get a little bit closer to the edge, a little bit closer to the precipice. So, don't listen to me. I mean, I'm just a general and will probably be accused of being a Cassandra. Listen to George Robertson, the architect of the strategic...
No one ever says they are just a general.
The architect of the Strategic Defence Review, who said, we are not safe. And we need to be much, much more honest with the British people. We aren't safe, and we don't have much time.
One of your colleagues, another former chief of the General Staff, said that we are in the foothills of World War III. Are we?
I'm not sure I buy the World War metaphors because I still think that we have agency to prevent this. What we are in is in an era where the use of force by authoritarian states is become normalized, has become, if not acceptable. Two members of the UN Security Council have gone to war on the basis of some pretty patchy international legal justification, the United States and Russia. That's just a fact. This is the world that we live in now. And so if you want to restore an order that isn't based on multipolarity and might makes right, but goes back to multilateralism and international cooperation, then what we do in the present really makes a difference. So Ukraine matters enormously, not just for the Ukrainians, but for us, because this is the fulcrum. If you can't achieve a Russian defeat in Ukraine, then the world is going to look very, very different in 4 or 5 years' time. It'll be much, much more like the law of the jungle. And by defeat, I mean denying Putin those 3 objectives that we described earlier on. And we can do that if we choose to do so. Europe, which has immense power in one dimension, economic power, but has very limited power in terms of technology or hard power, but a lot of potential. If we can turn Europe into a 3-dimensional power, and I include ourselves in that geographical European description, we can shape the future. And this is what Mark Carney was talking about, at the Munich Security Davos. So I don't buy that there is an inevitability about some form of global conflict on World War III scale, but you can see the risks of it emerging. This is why it feels like the 1930s. We still have agency. Why aren't we acting on it?
And in this world, in this new world disorder, what is the most disruptive element? Is it Russia becoming aggressive? Is it China sitting on the sidelines, building up a vast military that hasn't yet been used? And maybe Xi Jinping is careful when he's seeing what's going on. Or is it the United States, Uncle Sam channeling Dirty Harry?
So, first of all, we should bear in mind that the 80 years of relative peace that we have enjoyed in this international system, the international order, has been largely achieved because the United States has been prepared to underwrite it. And we owe them an immense debt of gratitude for that burden that they have carried. They are in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. But they no longer have the relative economic or hard power that they used to have. And it's just become too hard for them to sustain it. President Trump is an extreme expression of a set of views that the United States often has in its political cycles. He's accelerated that process of transition, but we shouldn't be surprised by it. Arguing in some respects, President Biden was the anomaly. And this is more continuity from Obama.
And we can't
to Trump,
expect it to go back to what it was before.
We should not expect the United States to resume its international leadership role. And arguably, confidence has been so shaken in the United States' statements and over the last, President Trump's, that it'll be difficult to regain that sort of moral authority and legitimacy that the US had. But it's not the US's fault that we're here. It is because you've had a rising power, China, challenging the status quo. You've had a collapse of legitimacy in that system that everybody believed in. You've had extraordinary technological shifts. So AI, as a foundational technology, is accelerating change at a pace that is incredibly disruptive. And then we haven't adapted to those. So this transition, this flux that we're in, depends on the future. How we shape that future depends on what we do now. And by now, I don't mean in 2035. I don't mean in 2040. I mean now.
Just one final one. It's always struck me, whether it was Iraq, the first Gulf War with Kuwait, or especially with Iraq in 2003, that America relies very heavily on the smartness of its weapons. They've got incredibly smart weapons. They've got some very smart soldiers. But what we're seeing in this war in Iran is that even if you have cheap and not very smart weapons, if you have a clear idea of what you're fighting for, and this regime is clearly fighting for its survival, and you can also tell yourself a story based on mythology and history and all these other things that really matter. You know, the Battle of Karbala in their case, which is a glorious defeat for the Persians. These things ultimately decide the outcome of a war, or can do, because you measure it along those particular lines. And the trouble with relying on smart bombs but not having very smart ideas about going into war is not good.
So I'm going to get a little bit militarily philosophical on you, but there are, you look at war through two dimensions. The nature of war never changes. It's constant, it's violent, it's primordial, it's an extension of politics by other means. So that always is the same. The character of war, how things play out on the battlefield, depending on technology, geography, who the combatants are, that evolves all the time. Warfare, Clausewitz tells us, is a battle of wills. So your strategy, if your strategy is to destroy the enemy's forces, then it's only going to get you so far. But if your strategy is to break the enemy's will, that ultimately is what decides the outcome. And at the moment, what you have is one side for whom this is an existential struggle and who have an ideology that is based on resistance and martyrdom. Sure. And you have another side for whom this is a war of choice. And in Israel's case, just one more cycle of mowing the grass in Iran, which they've been expecting to do and will continue to expect to do. If they get regime change, great, but they don't necessarily expect it. And the technologies you're talking about, largely based around the exploitation of artificial intelligence in the targeting process, but crucially, the autonomous systems, which can be produced at vast scale, which give smaller countries the ability to offset these exquisite technologies and to survive through doing so. This is the future of warfare that we have to adapt to. But it also, and I'm going to bring this back to the UK, gives us a tremendous opportunity. Because if we're serious about this deadline of 3 to 5 years, none of the existing defense programs are going to have us ready in 3 to 5 years. They're all decades-long programs. You're not going to see the Global Combat Air Program, the aircraft, until the mid-2030s. You're going to see submarines until the mid-2040s. We've got a 2030 timeline that we need to address. Take a leaf out of the Ukrainians' book. Listen to the defense technology companies who are saying, we could vastly enhance your lethality, your capability on the battlefield, and we could do it in the next 2 years. That's what I'd like to see the defense investment program investing in.
We'll be watching. General Sir Patrick Sanders, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That's it from the Fourcast. See you next time.